Welcome to DJNTV and Tuesday Night with Ben Stowe. Now introducing the one and only Ben Stowe.
Yeah, baby! Yeah. Good evening and welcome to tonight's show, where we're going to answer the question you have had burning in the back of your mind forever.
What are the winning lottery numbers?
We're going to leave a pause there, Ben, so that they can enter, or they'll put that question in there, and then we'll not answer that question.
Yeah, well, where's the fun in that?
Exactly. So tonight's show, we're going to discuss, will we see Luke Skywalker in another Disney miniseries? And go!
Boy, I hope so. That was pretty good. I think we're going to see a few others, though. You know, Thrawn, and there's no rules anymore. Like, I mean, they've shown that they can what they can do, and I don't. Anyway, we can't get down that road, or we'll never not have a show tonight.
That's true. But it's now we're past that point where we're being nice and not referring to for spoiler type things. So now we're past that point. So the speculation can begin at a future time.
I think I speak for many Star Wars fans when we saw the prequels, and now we see Mandalorian, and we see all the other new series that Disney has announced, and we're saying we could have had that all along.
Isn't that the truth?
We could have had this. I would go to the theater to see Mandalorian.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they've just did a wonderful job. And now we have Star Wars questions coming.
I love our viewers. Viewers, I love you. I love you.
Okay, so the first question is, we'll answer. We're going to give you 3 minutes, and that's it. We're just three, and we're going to go to our chord topic.
Three, so, that's generous. All right,
yeah, we're going to go 3 minutes to do these. Your favorite Star Wars character, Ben, go.
Darth Vader.
Okay, which one was the best Star Wars movie?
Empire.
That's interesting. That's
changed as I've gotten older.
And that would have been my take. And then people were talking about Rogue One being.
I'd put that number 2. Man, no, I take that back. I can't not have A New Hope in as that has to be number 2. So I would put Rogue just because it started it all. I would say Empire is the best one, but without New Hope, there is nothing else. So I would put Rogue One number 3. Yeah,
I actually made the kids watch Rogue One the other night again, just because everyone's talking about it's the best, and when you watch it the second or third time, it does well. It's not one of those movies where you're like, oh, this sucks. I mean, it was well done. So Empire, Return of the Jedi. All right. Let's get to tonight's topics before we go any further. Tonight, Ben, we're going to dig into cords, extension cords, power cords, the thing that's going to power our events, and the reason why this is going to be important for those of you who are wondering why we're talking about this, and we have talked about this on past shows. We're going to come into the summer season, and we're going to be doing more outdoor events. And many times when we're doing outdoor events, there isn't the code of having an outlet every 6 to 12 feet in the room, depending upon what it is. When we're outside, they might be 13, 14 feet away or so.
Add a 0, maybe.
So there's times where we're going to have to do that. So we need to understand that all cords are not alike. They're like snowflakes.
It's true. We have lots of those in Minnesota too, but
more coming. So
I'll spend a lot of time looking at the snowflakes. It's a snow drift as far as I'm concerned.
And by Friday, it will be a huge snow drift. But that's
that's the thing. Working at home, I feel like I'm just in this weird bubble where it doesn't matter. I'm like,
Is that because what you honey? There's a snowbank in front of the house. Go shovel it.
Why? We're not going anywhere.
See that snowbank? Yeah. It'll be spring and it'll melt, and June's coming.
We've had so little snow this year relative to previous years, and I think I know why. Because I learned my lesson, and this fall I drove fence posts to sort of mark the outline of my driveway so I'd know when I was snow blowing.
Yes.
Well, I have no trouble finding
it. No, it's probably very apparent where the driveway and
it's very apparent,
yeah. So extension cords, there's a variety of different things. There are different sizes, lengths, what have you. So let's kind of give, for people who have no idea of why one might be better for an application than the other, let's start with the basics of what an extension cord does.
Well, I think in the simplest of terms, an extension cord, and I actually have a really, really short one, which we'll actually talk about a little later, sort of my special cord, but an extension cord takes power from one side and extends it to the other. So this would be like almost the world's shortest extension cord, but that's not really what it's for. But I mean, in the simplest of terms, an extension cord brings the power to where you need it from wherever that receptacle is located outdoors. And as you said, there's lots of different, factors here, I think is a good way to say it. Mm-hmm. And I'll just be very blunt and not even the least bit coy about it. Size matters. And at risk of getting us kicked off the air, if you need to go longer, you also need to go thicker. So let's just...
Wow, this show's deteriorated so much. So anyway, Mr. Rogers, he's a really nice guy.
You know, I love Fred Rogers, and I think the world needs a lot more Fred Rogers. I've just begun to accept the fact that that's not me. I'm not that guy. I need to just talk about chords. So, all tongue-in-cheek, thinly veiled references aside, let's get into the physics of it a little bit. I've got some examples for you.
Sure.
And we measure the thickness of a cord in American wire gauge, and that applies to all non-ferrous metals, which means non-iron. So it applies to aluminum and copper and that sort of thing. You'll hear me mention that again a little bit later, but for today's show, we're going to talk exclusively about copper. We're just going to assume that every cord you use is copper, and that's a pretty safe bet. So let's take a look right away. We'll start at gauge, and then we're going to talk about why that's so important. But while I'm at it, I'm also going to take an opportunity to talk about different jacket types. So what we see here is a fairly typical cord that you might see in your system.
Yep.
It's an IEC C13 end on it.
And ironically, mine also has the end cut off because I put it in a place and it got snipped. But that's
these were cut on purpose. But...
Yeah, mine wasn't. But, thankfully it wasn't plugged into anything and wasn't being used. But.
So what we can see when we look inside here, there are our copper conductors. Mm-hmm. And this is an 18 gauge cord. And the smaller the gauge number, the bigger the wire itself. So for comparison, and you can see that inside there's 3 wires that are each 18 gauge. For comparison's sake, this is a 2 gauge. Not 2 gauge. This is a 2/0.
There we go. Yeah.
So yeah, a 2/0. And this one's actually been worn down a little bit by being plugged into panels. But you can see there's a pretty substantial difference between 2/0 and 18. All right.
And it is copper that he was holding up. It isn't some bad cigar from Cuba.
No, it's copper. You know, how sad is that? I'd rather have the cable. I'm such a nerd.
But it looked like a kind of a bad cigar.
Another example, a couple more examples here. 18 gauge and 16 gauge are actually pretty close. But when we look at these two cables, this one is 16 gauge and this one is 18 gauge. The 16 gauge certainly looks much bigger. And if we look at the actual copper inside, it is bigger. Mm-hmm. But that's not what makes this cable so much bigger. This cable also has a much more rugged jacket. And that's why I wanted to make this example. You can see this one is kind of plasticky and shiny. Mm-hmm. And this one is thick and rubber. These are fine for our, plugging our system in, close to the speaker, that sort of thing. But anybody who uses these cords know that this plastic jacket will break over time. It'll deteriorate fast. I don't love it, especially not for extension cords. I don't love a thermoplastic jacket. Those typically what you're going to get at a Home Depot or Lowe's or Menards. And that might be fine for a homeowner who's going to use it occasionally. Me, I want all my cables to be pro and industrial and rugged. And there are two different models. This is an SOOW, and then there's lots of different letters here that stand for oil and water and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. SJOW is plenty good. That's a 300-volt jacket, and so it'd be a little bit thinner than this. This is an SOOW, but it's going to hold up really, really well outside, and it's going to stay really flexible, and it's going to last a really long time. So I just wanted to talk about jackets for a second. And then...
Hang on, before you go any further.
Okay.
That particular... Now, there's different colors. Does the color of the jacket matter when it comes to... Does that have any bearing?
Not a bit.
Okay.
Not a bit. And in fact, inside, inside the cable, typically we'll see a few color options. And the copper doesn't have any idea what color is on it. That's why it's important for us to know and to wire it correctly. But here we can see some white, green, and black.
Mm-hmm.
And inside this cable, if we looked, we would actually see blue, brown, and yellow. U.S. standard, European standard.
Oh,
This
okay.
is going to be really common that's what you're going to see is the European standard on thing because much of our stuff is imported. Anyway, your U.S. standard is black, white, and green, but they do the same thing. You just have to, know what goes to what. I think wiring a cable might be a different show.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the real quick primer. Inside your connector, you're going to see a silver screw. You're going to see a brass colored screw, and you're going to see a green one. And the white goes to silver, the black goes to brass, and the green goes to the ground always.
Another jacket question.
Okay.
Are there any jackets that are better in wet circumstance, or are you going to cover that later?
No, we definitely can. And again, if we look at these letters, and this one actually, it's written pretty brightly and clearly, so maybe you use that.
Yeah.
Tell me when it comes into focus.
No, we can see there's writing there. So
Okay. Well, this one says SOOW, which is sunlight, oil, water. So again, we're talking about fairly short-term applications. So these should be fine in, outdoor use like that. If you're talking, and again, make sure there's no cracks or, abrasions or anything that could let water in to get to the conductors. That's when you're going to start to have some real problems.
right.
But again, just a really nice SOOW or SJOW or, but a good pro rubber jacket in good repair will be fine for wet-ish locations.
Mm-hmm.
Don't go throw it in the lake, right? But just a little common sense will keep you alive a long time, folks. So just for the sake of comparison now, we can compare. So I'll see if I can do a little bit of a lineup here. Here we've got 18 gauge, 16 gauge, and 12 gauge. And I do have a 14 gauge we can drop in there. That is what we use inside of our hybrid cables, is we use a 14 gauge power conductor. And you'll see why we felt that was a really good compromise of amperage carrying capacity and size, because a bigger cable is heavier and costs more. And we wanted to, make this affordable and easy to coil, but at the same time, it needs to carry enough current.
Mm-hmm.
Now, our hybrid cables are typically only 25 or 50 feet, so keep that in mind for later on. But another fun thing you'll notice inside our hybrid cable is not only do we shield the heck out of our signal carrying conductors, but we've also shielded our power conductor. And that is to keep noise from getting across the cable, but that's a different show. Excuse me. So now that we've covered the size, let's talk about why size matters. And it really does. All joking aside, it's very important in gauge. Very important for our power cables, maybe more so than anything else. And then I'll just leave that go.
Mm-hmm.
But it's time to drink. I've got a cool little illustration here if I can find it. This shows us something called Ohm's law. This basically is the relationship between ohms, volts, and amps. Ohms is resistance. You can see that it's preventing the flow of electricity. Volts is the pressure of the electricity, and amperes is the flow of the electricity.
Okay.
So there's our little cartoon primer to understand why this matters. Now, we're going to dive right into figuring out, and I've got viewers, stick around. Don't fast forward if you're watching this later. Stick around because I'm going to show you a summary and a bit of a chart, and I'll make that chart available to anybody that wants it as well. I can email it to you or whatever. But I think it's really important to understand how we get there. So let's talk about, this relationship between volts, amps, resistance, and our cord size. I think it's fairly reasonable. It's pretty easy to understand that the bigger the cord, the less resistance, right? The bigger around the cord is, the more stuff that can go through it. Think about like a water pipe, okay? So it's really important to understand how much current or amperage our equipment draws. And I'm going to show you a couple other examples here, because that's probably the number one question I get is, how much does my system draw? How much do I need? And by the way, I should have given you a heads up on this, John, so you could actually link the show where we did. Can I get 1,000 watts, from 100 watts or whatever? And so their shows on picking speakers. So I'll just kind of mention them, and you can maybe put those links in the description. People can watch those. It'll blow your mind that a 1,000-watt speaker is not 1,000 watts. But let's take a look at this. In fact, this kind of will make the point for me. The Evolve 50, which of course everybody knows I love. It's a great system. So I'm putting in a system that sounds great, performs great, because it makes a great example. Here we can see power consumption right here. Now, important to note too, you'll see this, all these little things. These are probably the most important numbers in engineering, are the numbers right after a word. You can see that this is at 1/8 power. And again, go back and watch those shows on 1,000 watts and that sort of thing. You'll see why. You'll see why a 1,000-watt speaker is not 1,000 watts. And why it really doesn't matter. You don't listen to watts anyway. But what we can see here is this operates on a global voltage range of 100 to 240 volts AC with a current draw of 1.5 to 0.6 amps. And that's very important. And you say, why is that range? Well, because the voltage can range. They're directly proportional. And we're going to do some math here. I knew that you just, it's been a couple of weeks since we did a show. People thought if I don't do some math, the world is just not going to be right.
This is so exciting. Math.
The good news here is that they have basically published this rating for you. So if you were trying to add this up, you could say, okay, so I know that at 1/8 power, this thing uses about 1.2 at 120 volts. So I could just kind of add that up and start figuring out what my system draws. Now, because we've done this in other videos and we've talked about how, it can be difficult to figure out what your stuff draws. And I swear to you, I get not a cent if you buy one of these. I wish I did. If somebody knows somebody at the Kilowatt Company, please tell them I am just pimping out their stuff like crazy.
We've sent a few things their way.
My goodness, I wish I should be driving a car with a Kilowatt sticker on the side, courtesy of them. But anyway, these little things here are so handy. You can plug it into the wall, plug your system into the front, plug your speaker into the front up to a maximum amount. I think max is like 15 amps on this, and it will show you what the current draw that your system is actually using. That can be really handy to understand how much is my system using. By the way, I talked about my super special little short extension cord, and I'll show you what this is. This is just one more way that I can measure amperage if I don't happen to have a kilowatt handy. This is always in my tool bag. Here I have the hot conductor isolated, so I can use a clamp amperage meter, and I can measure that this way. And I can then see how much current is flowing through my short little extension cord. Kids, don't try this at home. And anytime you have a single conductor isolated, it works. We do that very frequently when we're connecting with these, we're using like 5 of them. A 3-phase circuit, 3 voltage carrying, and then a neutral, and then our ground. But here again, clamp on here, and it'll tell me
what's rolling through there.
So let's say that you don't know, or let's say that your manual has a number in watts. Now again, be careful with speakers, because 1,000 watts does not mean you're using 1,000 watts. But let's just take a look at what that means in terms of doing this. So let me see if I can find my graphic. I think you see it. No, I just need to see it.
I do see. I see a circle that is confusing.
Right. There it is. It's funny, I couldn't find it. It was buried on my screen. What we see here, this is called an ohms wheel, not to be confused with the Camelot wheel, for those of you who are DJs that are mixing.
I was trying to figure out how do you mix across that wheel. I couldn't do it.
It's not nearly as cool. But what we can see here in the center spokes is what we are solving for. So if we want to solve for power, we use these out here. If we want to solve for amperage, we use these formulas out here. If we want to solve for resistance, or if we want to solve for voltage. Now, all we have to know is any two, and we can solve for the other two. So in this case, we want to solve for amperage, because all of our information is going to be relevant to amperage. And I'm going to talk next about volt drop, and that's going to be you'll see why amperage is so important. So let's say that we know, turn on my annotation here. let's say that we have a light, an incandescent light. Remember those?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm taking the easy way out, viewers, because these are resistive loads and they're really easy to calculate. So as to not turn this into an MIT dissertation, we're just going to assume we have a 1200 watt resistive load. So I've got 1200 watts. This is me trying to write with a mouse. And I need to solve for amperage on this. Now, to make this really easy on myself, because I'm kind of lazy, I'm going to assume that my voltage is a straight up even 120. So in order to solve for amperage, I can simply find my power, which is here, and my voltage. And we can see that as I've written it here, power divided by voltage will equal 10 amps, right? Super easy math. This really isn't that hard. Honestly, this really isn't that hard. Even when you start getting into square root of power over resistance, that's a little bit more of a pain. But honestly, you're not going to ever have to do that. You're going to probably be working with power or amperage. And if you have amperage, you already have what you need. So operating on this, now we figured out what our amperage is. But again, we can solve for any of these using that information. Let's get crazy and let's do, you know what? I should have left that up. I'm gonna go back to that. Okay, so we've got our 10 amps. And we want to figure out what size cord do I need, what gauge do I need to carry this 100 feet.
Okay.
We're going to do lots of ones and zeros here, make it super easy.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm annotating on things I don't want to annotate on. So just for the sake of fun, let's just pick a few gauges here. And I need to move this window. Excuse me. It does not let me move windows when I have the annotation tool on. That is fantastic. Just talk amongst yourselves while I get my life figured out. All right. So what we want to do...
We're still seeing the circle. Because you got to share the specific window you want to share.
No, I'm actually good. If you can see the volt wheel and my 10 amps, then I'm back to the right place.
Perfect.
Okay. Thank goodness. So what we want to solve for is volt drop, and we want to keep our volt drop to approximately 3 to 5% maximum. 3% would be or less would be ideal. 5% would be, I think, the maximum. Those are actually numbers that come from the National Electric Code, but they're for a good reason, right? They're also common sense. Mm-hmm. With outdoor, we have to talk about heat too, so don't let me forget that. But to calculate volt drop, we're just going to take this formula, 2 times the length times the amperage times the resistance. And I apologize for my handwriting. I'm literally drawing that with a mouse.
Yeah, no, we're good. We can read it. 2 times 2 times LAR.
Sorry?
It's 2 times LAR.
Yeah, 2 times LAR, exactly. So in order to make this easy, I'm gonna sort of kind of skip ahead and do a little bit of the math for you. But you can look up these values for, again, copper. I can give them to you. Actually, I've got them right here. So let's just start at 12 gauge. That is 1.588 ohms per 1,000 feet. Okay, so if we take 100 foot of cable, and on a 12 gauge cord, you know what? I feel like I'm going to type this. Yeah, I'm switching to typing. We should make that bigger. Can you see that all right?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's on the main part of the screen. So.
All right, good. So at 12 gauge, that is a about 3.18. If we take our 0.001588 times 2 times our length, which is 100, times our amperage, which is 10, we will come up with that. And that at 120 volts is about 2.65% drop.
Okay.
So if we started with 120 volts, we're going to end up with 116.82, which is totally good. All right, we can live with that. You know, every time we do a show, I say I'm going to practice with the annotation tool so I can get better at this. And then I don't. At 14 gauge, it's now twice as much resistance, 2.525 ohms per 1,000 feet. So we can see the result of that here. It's now 5.05 volts dropped, which is 4.21%. And so we are just basically skating on the edge of whether or not that is acceptable. It's in the range, 5% max. We could get away with it. We can live with it. Keep this in mind. But again, we can see that it's so important because it's based on the resistance of the wire, which is directly related to the gauge, and the amperage of the circuit. So the more amperage we're trying to pull, and we're only doing 10 amps here, and the length. All those things are part of the equation. So if we do 16 wire gauge, excuse me, that is 4.016 per 1,000 feet. You can also do this in circular mills if you're really feeling adventurous, by the way. But electricians that are watching will know all about that. They'll be like, oh, why'd I have to bring that up, right? If we go to 14 gauge, you can see that that's now a loss of 8.03 volts, which, of course, takes us to a 6.69% drop, which we have deemed unacceptable. This show, by the way, comes directly because a friend of mine reached out and said, hey, I had some problems with my show last week, and I was a country mile down the road, and, you know, does it really matter? And I said, yes, it really does matter. So to you, the anonymous viewer, thanks for giving this great idea for this show. 18 wire gauge, which we saw, really wimpy and skinny. I mean, come on, if you're running 18 gauge wires for 100 feet, knock it off. You're not going to get the approval from me on that. No way, no how. Go big or go home, right? That's 12.77, which is 10.64% loss. Should be a percent, not a dollar. So that's a big deal. We don't want that.
Just bad.
Now, again, bear in mind, if it's outside in the summer and it's hot and that jacket starts to warm up, we have to derate this a little bit too. So our capacity actually goes down a little bit when these cables get hot. So having extra capacity is always a good thing. I pretty much all of my cords are 12 gauge, except for the 2/0 and 4/0 feeder cables, which, by the way, I bet you're really dying to know. What would happen if we used a 2/0 feeder cable? So let's figure it out. Now, this assumes, again, single phase, just 120 volt AC, which is not typically what we use those for, but I know you're dying to know.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
This is 0.07793 ohms per 1,000 feet. So it's very low resistance. Makes sense. A lot of copper in a 2/0, right? That's this guy. Remember him? So our loss here is 0.16 or 0.13%. In other words, there virtually isn't any at all. So, you know, when people, you know, write me up or call me and say, I need to go 500 feet, I'm like, you need a new plan, you know, like feeder cable, you know, you need, and by the way, they're really expensive. There's a lot of
so as long as we're talking feeder cable size, typically, like for houses, they're feeding those with aluminum. Does that a difference between aluminum and copper in a situation with the larger gauge when you're doing such as you are, where you're coming in there with the 2/0 wire? Would it matter if it's copper or aluminum?
It does, and for lots of reasons. You know, aluminum's fine for a house. They're not as flexible. It's not, you know, let me see if I can actually pull up a calculation for you. So let's just say, let's assume that we had a 12 gauge aluminum, and we're going 100 feet at 10 amps. So our copper value was 2.65%. If we do that with aluminum, it's 4.17%. But there's a lot of things that are, again, that's not even the least of my concerns with using aluminum versus copper. It's not as flexible. It's not as friendly. You know, copper's the way to go.
Sure.
Okay? Again, wiring a house, well, it totally doesn't matter. Plus, we have, you know, transmission lines, and it's a whole different ball of wax. So if it sort of feels like I'm kind of avoiding the question, I am, because I don't even want to give that much. Yeah, I just don't even want to give that much conversation to aluminum.
It's meant for the house, running a line into the house, and that's its best purpose for it.
Yeah, just don't. Use copper. Again, use rubber jackets. I think that'll treat you really well. But then, if we take all these things that we learned, again, how much current is your equipment drawing? That's the amperage figure we talked about. What's the gauge of your wire? How far do you need to go? That'll bring us to my handy dandy chart.
The chart.
Which, let me bring that up. One of these days, we need like a big budget graphics producer or somebody who can actually, somebody who has their life together better than I do.
I thought our first step was to get consistent ice cream deliveries. Then we were going to do
that has been a real problem lately, by the way.
I mean, I thought everything else was secondary to that.
I know where the problem lies there, but if I want to stay living in this house, I'm not going to rock the boat too much. So anyway, here's a chart that I put together, and this works on kind of sort of between 3 and 5%. So most of these figures are kind of right around 4%. Mm-hmm. This is not the end all save all. This should not be used in conflict with any manufacturer's recommendation or any manufacturer's ratings. Those always take precedence over anything that I'm going to say. This is for general reference. And again, I'll be happy to send it to you. But taking everything we just looked at, here we can see if we're going 100 feet and we're going 10 amps, as we saw, 14 gauge will work. It's acceptable. And bigger is always okay. You don't lose electrons in the cord. You can always go with 12. If this chart says 14, you can always go 12.
Sure.
But you can see here, if we need to go 200 feet, at 10 amps, a 12 gauge won't even work anymore. Now we need to go 10 gauge, which is even bigger than 12 gauge. Moving on, you can see if I need to go 10 amps, 500 feet, my chart doesn't account for that. You need, like I said, you need something else. You need new game plan, in those scenarios. And I know this is not a popular ask. Your results may vary, but in those scenarios, I have had no problem going to the client and saying, you need to put power here. You need to, whatever you have to do. In fact, I know again for a wedding ceremony, that might be a little harder than a concert, but I remember watching utility bucket trucks come in and go around the block to make sure the inspector was gone and then come back and disconnect a pole and drop cable. I just stood there in awe. I'm like, this is the greatest thing I've ever seen. They're literally pulling power off of a pole for me. This is fantastic. But, this is something that a licensed electrician can do fairly inexpensively. And that's a relative term, of course. But, if you need to go 500 feet, that conversation can be had with the client to say, I can't go 500 feet. That's not something I can do. Electrician can come in and put maybe a construction drop or something and maybe get you within 200 feet. Anyway, always have the conversation with your client. I think waiting until the gig and having problems is not the day to figure out that you need
not so much.
It doesn't go too well. So anyway, hopefully this chart is very helpful. Again, if we look here, if you go less than 2 amps and you're going 50 feet, 18 gauge will work. You probably got a sense that I don't really like 18 gauge. You're right. I don't have any 18 gauge extension cords because if I have 12, why do I need 18? You know, why have 2 and 1 will do? Just get the right one and be done with it. But you could. So questions. So
does the little tab that inserts into the outlet, the little prongs, do they matter of their material or the composite of those, composition of those? Excuse me.
Well, I mean, do they matter? The composition? Well, not really. I think what matters more is your cord is UL listed or has some type of approval. To me, that's essential. If it does, then however it was made is not really of your concern. It doesn't really matter what they used. The prongs do matter. They're polarized. One is thicker than the other, and that's to designate which is the hot and which is the neutral on a polarized cord. And of course, in fact, you can see that here on the front of the kilowatt. Pretty hard to get it wrong anyway, because the ground is always going to have to go in the center, bottom hole. But no, I wouldn't give a ton of thought as to what the composition of those prongs is.
So we have a situation where we have to go 300 feet. They're wondering if you're having a discussion with a client beyond having an electrical drop brought in, what other options would you recommend as alternatives?
Generator. Again, if you're doing a ceremony and you've got a generator, it might be loud. It might be something you don't want, and you may have to try to mitigate that noise. You can do battery, temporary power, those power cell things. Like Duracell makes a 1400 watt model or something.
I've seen, quite a few coming out here.
But those are really your options. I mean, again, or you can try to go 500 feet or 300 feet. Bigger is better, and you're sort of hoping at that point. Tesla hasn't given us, and I don't mean Elon Musk, I mean Nikola Tesla, hasn't given us wireless power like he promised.
Mike is asking here if NLFX makes those 10 or 12 gauge extension cords.
We do. We don't actually now, unlike our mic cable, which is ours. It is uniquely ours. We don't actually make the cable. We buy the cable in bulk and put connectors on it for you. And we use Leviton or Hubble ends. These really nice pro ends. But yeah, we do make extension cord sets, and they're pretty beefy and nice. And honestly, wasn't something that we really had kind of planned to make, but y'all kept asking for it, so we made them for you.
Sure.
Most of this, for example, these cords that I have here are samples from our tech department of cord that we would use. So,
Mm-hmm. Heavy gauge, or the proper gauge, and the rubber jacket that you prefer.
Yeah, and this is one that we took apart, I think probably for the show, actually. But, as you can see, we put the length on them as well for you. So this one is a PowerCon. It's all the same. Once it gets inside, it's all the same. It's just voltage.
So someone has a retractable cord. If you've seen those, of course, that little spool, and you pull and it kind of window shades it. Are there any concerns with using retractable cords in your system? I'm going to ask that way, David, because I want to make it a little wider than that.
I have 3, and it doesn't mean that you shouldn't, but I have 3. Mm-hmm.
That's why I asked it this way, David, because I knew where he would go with this. So that's why
you know me so well, John. Yeah, we've been friends for 20 years, and we've been doing shows for 6. And I would say number 1 is the wear on the cord as it gets wound tighter and tighter. Depending on the minimum, size of that spindle, that can put a lot of extra strain on a cord. Some of the cord winders are really good, and I don't have that concern. And others, are like the old 8-track tape where they just keep winding it until it snaps. 2 would be, magnetic field generation. And I've seen that where I've seen coil of wire plugged into a sound system and the sound system's buzzing. Uncoil the wire and the buzz goes away. There's just, I've seen stuff.
Yeah.
And 3 would be heat. As that energy is traveling through the wire, amperage in particular, it's generating heat. And if you don't have my Geek Boot Camp DVD, it is probably not the best $30 you can spend, but it's the best $30 you can spend for me. Pick one of those up, because we actually did take a couple extension cords and we put them under load, and we used an infrared camera. And this was several years ago, and it was hard to get one. We had to go to our local fire department to do that. But anyway, you can see how the cable is getting hot under load, and you can see how much hotter a 16 gauge cord got versus a 12 gauge cord under the same load. So anyway, Geek Boot Camp's a DVD. Please buy 2 or 3 copies, because you can really never have too many, and give them away as gifts. People love them.
So I had it right. I figured the heat, and I figured the coiling or the winding where they're going to be, but I hadn't even thought about the magnetic potential of the coil.
Yeah. So that would be something, just one thing, to try. If you've got a big old coil of wire and you've got some noise issues, try eliminating the coil and see if it goes away. It's a quick thing to do. But that doesn't mean don't use them. It just means use them while you know those things and be aware.
Yeah, in a lower electric draw need, they would probably be fine. Next question. Is there a difference between a 300-volt wire and a 600-volt wire?
So the question, we talked about that a little bit earlier. This is an SJOOW, and you probably can't read the writing, but this one says 300-volt, and that's with a J. The J is junior. And then this one that I had here somewhere is an SOOW, so it's missing the J, so it's not a junior. And this one we can see says, maybe you can see 600 volts.
No, not quite. Just about, but not quite. No, there it is. Oh, I saw 600V.
Yeah. So this one is a 600 volt. This one is a 300 volt. In essence, what we're talking about here, and you also see a couple other things. This one says 105 degrees Celsius. This one says 90 degrees Celsius. So remember me talking about the heat and derating? So that's why those considerations are there. Now, does it matter for you when you're running? You're saying, well, I'm only running 120 volts. Why does it matter? It maybe doesn't. You know, the 600 volt cord is an industrial, heavy duty, hard use cord. Whereas the SJOOW or SJOW is a junior 300 volt. Both are perfectly fine for running, carrying 120 volts. Just the 600 volt cord is going to be, in fact, maybe I should have started here. Just show the thickness of the jacket compared to the two.
Okay.
So
there we go.
That's what I'd say.
I think we caught up with our questions. We have a great crowd with us tonight. Thank you guys for being with this evening and for your questions. I put the link for the speaker, the 1,000 watt out of 100 watt draw. I put that. That
was
link.
A good show. That was a fun show because I think people just went.
Yeah, that was an interesting show, and you guys can check that out. It's down in the description. You may have to refresh the video on YouTube to see it, and if you're watching on Facebook, I'm sorry, you're not going to see it. But I put it in the chat, so it'll be in the chat. You can go find that up a ways. Just put it in there shortly after.
For those who want that chart, just comment or email, and I'll try to catch every comment. I don't see those till after the show, but if you want the chart, I'll send it to you. And again, it's a good general reference using round numbers. Get you in the neighborhood.
And as far as questions on the price of a 12 gauge 100 foot, just go give them a call at NLFX Pro. Give them a call tomorrow, and they can run.
Off the top of my head, I have no idea.
This is.
I can tell you how it works. I don't know what it costs.
Yeah, this is something you'll need to call in, and it doesn't mean you have to get 100 foot. You could, if your application you thought you needed 75 feet or you need 105 feet, whatever. That's the cool thing about getting custom cords made. You could have a cord made. A 50, a 55, a 60. You could do that all and be the cool guy on campus.
Yeah, and we've had people make different requests, changing the color of the heat shrink or putting clear unshrunk heat shrink on custom assemblies so they can put their own, identifier in there. Again, we do that a lot for venues and tours, and we can do it for you. It's just, the custom's custom, so we can do whatever you need.
Ben, a quick question on multi-tap cords. What is that?
So multi-tap, or typically they're called MOX, which stands for multi-outlet extension, sort of a smashed together, whatever. But they are cords that have, I'll try to simulate this. Maybe I've got my plug here, and then I've got an outlet here, and then I've got an outlet here, and then I've got another outlet here. We used to see those in kind of the early days of uplights when we didn't have power linking and fixtures, that sort of thing. But they're basically cords that have lots of outlets on them.
And you're following the same principles with the heavier gauge.
Nothing changes.
Yeah,
amperage, nothing changes. So think about your maximum amperage and size your cord appropriately.
Are the cords on the website?
The power cords?
Yes.
No, because they're a custom thing.
Okay.
There's a lot of things we need to get on the website. But
Yeah.
Look, if we had it on the website, we just wouldn't hear from you, and that'd make us sad. And we want to talk to you. So
yeah, so give them a call.
Yeah, just drop us a line. I think we are getting more of that stuff on the site. But again, if we do, it'll be in a variety of sizes that are the most common. But custom is always available. You can always say, I want a 106-foot cord for whatever reason. We don't ask questions. So. Actually, sometimes we do ask questions because we help customers a few times where we're like, all right, what are you plugging that into?
This is a little-
Because you just kind of go, that's not going to work. And then we've caught a few things where customers are like, well, I'm trying to do this. We're like, that's not how you do it. Okay, here's what you really need. You know, one more reason to not have it on the website. But extension cords, they're pretty hard to mess up. But that we could put on the website.
Well, that sounds good. Thank you, Ben, for putting things together for us tonight and sharing some information. And if you guys have any questions, you can reach out to Ben at LFX Pro. Just reach out to him and ask questions and order the proper cables for your configuration. 15 minutes. Go to DJNTV.com/chill. Tonight, Jay and Brian are going to get together. They've been hearing a little bit of stuff from NAMM, but they're going to talk NAMM stuff tonight. So if you have heard something, Ben can't go, by the way, because he has heard things, and it would just be not a good situation.
Next week, right? Next week we're doing a show with Katie.
Next week, yes, I think it'll be the all NAMM all night or something like that.
She got her hands on the new Rain 1. I've had my hands on some things that are pretty cool. Next week we'll kind of go through some of those. I do want to end with this, and if you've got more, that's great. But I want this to be the last thing I say. Honestly, no matter where you get your cords from, doesn't really matter to me. Just make sure you're using cords in good repair. Don't use cords that are cracked or broken or split, have broken connectors. This isn't the place to play around. So again, if you don't get your cords from us, that's fine. But do inspect your cords and use cords that are in good repair.
And well said. The links, DJNTV.com/chill. Go out there and hang out. They're going to be recording a session of it, and then they'll be kind of hanging out and having a good time tonight. So go out there, enjoy, and then plan to be with us next week as we are talking what's new at NAMM. Thanks again, Ben.